Today, WorldDenver is talking to Pankaj Mishra, journalist, author, public intellectual from India, who's here in Denver promoting his new book, From the Ruins of Empire, The Intellectuals Who Remade Asia. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Nader.
I want to begin by something that you have written recently that I found very fascinating, and I think many of the viewers of this program will also find fascinating. You stated that the central event of the last century was the intellectual and political awakening of Asia and its emergence from the ruins of both Asian and European empires. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this awakening and how it has developed in the world today?
This is really how the vast majority of the world's population saw it, and still sees it, that their liberation from Western imperialism in the last century and the creation of post-colonial states on the ruins of former European empires, this was the significant event. And everything else that people in the West, in the United States or in Europe, see as significant, such as the two world wars, they see those as landmarks in this particular journey. For instance, the Second World War in Asia was experienced by large numbers of people as liberation from European empires. The Japanese throughout, the Dutch from Java, the English from Singapore and large parts of the Malay Peninsula, the French from Vietnam. And then when they tried to get back there, they couldn't do so because the natives had been politicized. They'd also been empowered in many cases by the Japanese. So the entire experience of the 20th century for a lot of people in Asia was very different. They saw essentially their major task as one of liberation from Western hegemony. And that impacts very powerfully on how they see themselves today and the way they shape their destinies. In large parts of Asia, I mean, something like in a place like China, for instance, the events of the 19th century remain very potent today, when China was under the heel of several Western powers at that time, and the humiliations it suffered. And they remain very much, well, some might say kept artificially alive by the Chinese regime and the Chinese history textbooks. The fact that that's how they define their place in the world. And one of the things that the book tries to do is bring these experiences into play so that history isn't just this monologue about the West, the supremacy, the superiority of Western politics or economy or culture. It brings into play the fact that there are many people out there, hundreds of millions of them, who did not buy into this particular version of history, and that they have been creating their own histories all this time.
So would you say the book then is an attempt to sort of sensitize the reader to a broader view of history? How, in other words, Western history is not universal history, and that other peoples have their own historical experiences and transformative moments that are really central to their conception of who they are today in the world?
Absolutely. And this applies, mind you, not just to the reader in the West who's accustomed to a certain kind of history that places the West at the center of everything, but also to people in places like China, India, Indonesia, who are also accustomed to or have grown up on very parochial national histories that exclude the contributions of people elsewhere in Vietnam or China or Indonesia. The fact, which I describe in the book, that people in Egypt were being inspired by Japan's example, that students from Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon, or the Malay Peninsula or Java or Vietnam were traveling to Japan to learn from the example of Japan. As the whole generation of Chinese intellectuals was trained in Japan, which you wouldn't know if you were to focus on some of these nationalist histories. So what the book also seeks to describe is a moment of cosmopolitan exchanges across imperial and national borders.
We've just inaugurated Barack Obama as the president of this country for the second time. And you've recently have asked the question, who is the real Barack Obama? What did you mean by that?
Well, I hope we'll find that out in the next second term. He has been a disappointment in the first term. A lot of things he promised, such as closing down Guantanamo, for instance, he failed to realize that. There are many other things, such as the drone attacks, which intensified under his watch, and in fact were no longer confined to Pakistan, but also spread deeper into parts of Africa. And that's been a really extremely disturbing aspect to his presidency that is not talked about much in the United States, but is talked about very widely, extensively in other parts of the world. So I think I, as an early admirer of Obama, coming to him through his own writings, which I loved because they showed an extremely sensitive person, very much a person who's created himself, who's created a sensibility, a perception, an experience that so many of us in the post-colonial world can relate to very easily, that he was not an American or a Westerner whose history, whose perceptions are all handed down, that he was someone who created them all from scratch, more or less, with his mixed inheritance. So that kind of admiration which he evoked in so many of us, that really hasn't been, in a way, followed up by any concrete actions. And you have to wonder whether that kind of sensitivity to pain and to injustice, that kind of compassion he showed in the book, is something you can still express while you're occupying the White House, whereas the daily compromises of politics doesn't take too much out of you.
If there was one policy that Obama could pursue in his second term that would force you to reconsider your skepticism about his tenure as president, and that would make a real significant difference for, let's say, people in Asia, people in the developing world, what would it be?
I think most dramatically, if he were to stop or really curtail this whole policy of drone attacks, I think that would make a huge difference in how the United States is perceived around the world. Not to mention, following up on various other promises he made about closing down Guantanamo, and also prosecuting those who engaged in completely illegal and immoral activities like torture. I think this whole attitude of let's move on is probably not a very productive one. We do need some accountability on that. We do need people who engaged in those practices, or people who passed those orders. We do need to see them brought to justice. And I think that'll make a huge difference internationally, because what happened really when Obama was elected, there was this huge groundswell of support for him internationally. And that has really diminished dramatically. And so you see, again, anti-Americanism in various parts of the world growing back to the same levels that we saw during the presidency of George W. Bush. And that is largely because of this policy of drone executions.